and will also be available afterwards on the Academy YouTube channel. If you're on Twitter, please use and follow at @science_academy and use the handle #SpaceDawn, one word. If you're watching online and you'd like to ask Carol a question, please use that hashtag on Twitter so we can pick it up and have it answered later in the evening. With that, I would like to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Carol Oliver. Dr. Carol Oliver is the Deputy Director for the Australian Centre for Astrobiology at the University of New South Wales. Carol was originally a journalist working in the fields of print, radio, and television media. However, her focus soon turned to online teaching. After being successful in gaining 3 large grants, she established the Mars Lab at the Powerhouse Museum in Sydney. The Mars Lab is now a self-sustaining international education and space engineering research facility. Her focus is still on teaching, and she continues to explore e-learning and emerging virtual reality fields. Tonight, Dr. Oliver will take us on a journey to Mars and unveil the past, present, and future exploration of this remarkable planet. I should say, on a personal note, I've known Carol for about 15 years, and every time I talk, I come away with some type of insight, and I think you will probably hear, she will probably be able to tell you more than you ever thought there was to know about Mars. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Carol Oliver.
Thank you, Charlie. Well, welcome to the wonderful Shine Dome. It's a real honour for me to be here this evening. And I'm going to be talking to you about Australia's role in the search for life on Mars, and how appropriate that the second name for this building is the Martian Embassy. So I want to begin this talk with a little anecdote of how I became a member of the staff at the Australian Centre for Astrobiology in 2002. At that time, I was working for what is now the Western Sydney University in SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And Malcolm Walter, the then director of the ACA, called me and he said, "I'd like you to come and work for the ACA because I want to integrate education and outreach and science communication into the science." Well, that was pretty novel in those days, and actually it's pretty novel today, and that's how evidence-based science communication emerged at our centre. But I said to him, "Malcolm, I'm working in looking for intelligent life in the universe. Why would I want to come over to the ACA and look for dumb life?" And he laughed, as you did. And he said, "So you don't want to work with NASA?" So I stand here before you today, and I have indeed worked with NASA, especially in making virtual field trips. The Australian Centre for Astrobiology has been deeply involved in the search for life on Mars through its research interests, and I'll discuss those in a moment. It's also one of only 2 formal associate members of the NASA Astrobiology Institute, so we have a great deal of traffic between us and NASA. So the key research area for the centre is the earliest life on Earth. And actually, many of you might not know that we find the best evidence for that actually here in Australia, at 3.5 billion years old, is in the Pilbara of Western Australia. The reason that we find them just in Australia, there are some in South Africa, but they're degraded and they're not as old as the ones in the Pilbara. But the reason we find them here is the Pilbara is on what we call a craton. Now, a craton is very thick crust. We have plate tectonics on the Earth, and so much of our rocks today have been munched and crunched and digested by these plate tectonics. But these very thick cratons can't be subducted, so it has preserved this very old life. But actually, much of Western Australia is quite ancient as well. So there are some other areas of interest to us when we're looking at life at like 2.4 billion years when oxygen first arose on the Earth. But when we're thinking about life on Mars, we're looking at in that 3.5 billion year area, because if we're going to find past life on Mars, that's when it would have arisen on Mars. But the problem is, if you're going to search for life on Mars, then you're going to have some idea of what it's going to look like and what the chemical evidence might be for that life. It's okay to look at shapes and rocks and say, well, that looks like it might have been made by mats of microbes, but it's not good enough. It's not good enough because the organics could have come in at a later stage, so any organics found in it are not evidence that is life. So the Pilbara is actually an excellent analogue for looking for life on Mars, particularly since the same scientific dissension that has occurred there will also occur on any claims for evidence of life on Mars. This talk is split into 3 segments. In the first part, I'm going to talk a bit about the history of Mars, just briefly. Then I'm going to talk about the exploration of Mars and the steps really towards looking for life on Mars today. In the second bit, I'll enlarge a bit more on what I've just said about the Pilbara. And then finally, I'll talk about the Mars Lab. Each of those 3 segments has one short inspirational video that I'd like to share with you for different reasons, and I'll mention those as I go along. But let's begin with a little history. We've known about Mars all of recorded history. The ancient Egyptian and Chinese astronomers charted Mars, and the Greeks could predict its path. Galileo made the first telescopic observation. A century later, we could see enough detail on Mars to predict its rotation and also measure its axial tilt, which is about the same as Earth's. But seeing more on Mars had to wait till later in the 1840s. And this is what astronomers thought they saw. Between 1877 and 1888, Italian astronomer Schiaparelli made a series of observations of Mars. At about around the same time, astronomers thought they had detected a water signature on Mars. Well, Schiaparelli thought he saw canals, and then we had a water signature. So this generated ideas among science fiction writers and scientists alike that there was an ancient dying civilization on Mars, and these lines were the canals to take water from the poles to the equator to supply their fields to make the crops. But whatever these astronomers saw, it was not real. Not a single straight line has ever been found on Mars. But let's jump forward through all of the cultural history about Mars to space exploration of Mars. The very first close-up view we got of it was in 1964, and it was with Mariner 4. It did just a flyby of Mars, and the results were hugely disappointing. As you can see from this very grainy picture that was returned, it looks like the moon. And other mariners that followed that particular spacecraft also had the same images. The problem was, all of the images was coming from the southern hemisphere of Mars, which is heavily cratered. It took until 1971 for the next Mariner, Mariner 9, to go into orbit around Mars and find these sinuous channels that looked like dried up riverbeds. Scientists were amazed. It spurred the Mars program into developing a life-seeking mission. So in 1976, 2 Viking landers, each with their own orbiter for communications, two landers in case one failed, went to Mars, and both were successful in landing on Mars. They were very expensive. The mission cost in 1976 dollar terms, US $1 billion. Today, that would be 11 billion US dollars. So a considerable amount of money and energy went into this mission to directly search for biology on Mars. Now, remember what I said at the beginning here. You've got to know what you're looking for if you're going to look for life on Mars. But the scientists went straight for that goal, and that was a mistake because the 4 experiments on each of those spacecraft returned confusing results and inconclusive results. There are some people who believe that those experiments did show life on Mars, but they're in the minority today. We still think that the Viking landers did not find life on Mars. But the problem with this, so much money had been spent, and this was a disappointment, it was going to be another 2 decades before we returned to Mars. What spurred the next part of the Mars exploration was in 1996, and the discovery of this rock in Antarctica. It came from Mars, it was blasted off Mars, that happens on a regular basis, and we can find them in Antarctica because they're easy to see on the snow. And this particular rock, about the size of a large potato, was found in 1984. But it wasn't until 1996 that scientists at NASA broke it open and said they found past life on Mars. I don't know if this is working here, probably not. No, I'll not go for that. If you look at the top left-hand picture, you can see a Mars fossil, well, what they claim to be a Mars fossil. If this worm-like thing was a fossilized bacterium, it was 1/10 of the size of the smallest bacterium on Earth. So scientists weren't convinced. In the top right-hand one, you can see a line of beads. In the very top one is what we see on Earth called magnetite, and it's only produced biogenically. And below that, you can see the one they're claiming they can see in the rock. But again, if you're going to make extraordinary claims, you've got to have extraordinary evidence. And then they said, well, the carbonate globules in there are the result of microbial activity. The jury is still out on that, still not convinced that rock contains evidence of past life on Mars. But what was really important about that rock is it spurred the next generation of Mars exploration. It was sufficient to make us wonder whether indeed Mars has past or even present life. In the wake of the discovery of this rock, the NASA Astrobiology Institute was formed to work with universities in searching for life elsewhere in the universe, especially Mars. The following video charts the next 20 years of Mars exploration, bringing us up to the present. Bear in mind, 53% of all missions to Mars have failed, and this video speaks to the challenges that we can rise to in order to answer our most profound question of all: are we alone in the universe?
right side up. standing back for touchdown.
So what have we learned about Mars? On Earth, wherever there is water, there is life. Hence on Mars, we say, follow the water. Water drives the planet's systems, and its water drives the circumstances for life to occur. Mars is the most Earth-like planet in our solar system. It has a hydrosphere, an atmosphere, and a climate. How much water did Mars have in its past? Well, NASA scientists at NASA Goddard used the ratio of normal water to heavy water in both the past and in the present of Mars. And when they measured that, they found that they had 19% of the surface of Mars would have been covered by water. And it would have been probably in the northern hemisphere, which is lower. And so we have this very, very large sea. And that would have occurred about 4.5 billion years ago. There's other evidence of water on Mars. We saw those cyanurous channels from orbit with Mariner 9, but now on the ground we can see these channels are huge. They're very, very wide. They're riverbeds and steroids. And the Phoenix lander, which you saw during that movie, we detected these water droplets on the legs of the lander in the polar region of Mars in the summer months. Note the colorized dot in each of the 3 images, and it allows you to see the movement of the water across the leg. Why can this water exist in below freezing temperatures? Well, that was another discovery of Phoenix, that Mars has something in its soil that allows water to be liquid for very brief periods below freezing temperatures, and it's a salt called perchlorate. We now have found that also at Gale Crater. It's about 1% of the soil content. In fact, if we'd grown Matt Damon's potatoes in the Martian soil, they would have been poisonous because of the perchlorate. But there is a way of fixing that. You grow violets first, and it takes the perchlorate out. But this mission is actually a personal favorite for me, because for me, it was the beginning of a space romance. I had met my future husband on the internet, and our first date was watching that landing of the Phoenix lander. And so we met and we married in 6 months, and he's here in the audience tonight, so I guess it worked. And here is the evidence of perhaps briny water flowing today on Mars, flowing because of those perchlorates. These slope lineae, as they're called, come and go with the seasons, and they occur on the warmer side of the cliffs and the craters. And in the inset picture, you can see the locations are all near the equator where it's warmer. We had evidence of water on Mars even earlier than that. In fact, in 2001, where the Mars Odyssey gamma ray spectrometer gave us this picture of where Martian water was. The bluer and purple areas are where the water is most prevalent. The problem with this map is it tells us where the water is, but not how deep in the soil it is or how much of water is there. And this is going to be critical in human missions to Mars in later years. And lastly, another piece of evidence about water on Mars, actually in the southern hemisphere, where we think a sea occurred 3.7 billion years ago, up to 1,000 meters deep. In fact, we can see on the floor of that previous ocean evidence of hydrothermal vent activity, hot spring activity, in which we see here in Earth on bottom of our oceans, we see life surviving, thriving around those vents, far away from the sun, in the deep, deep dark, and existing on the chemical energy from those hydrothermal vents. The second strategy for looking for life on Mars is habitability and the signs of life. Curiosity in Gale Crater can do the former, and the 2020 mission will do the second much better later on. What do we mean about when we talk about habitability? What does that actually mean? Well, it really means we're looking for what life needs to form. So that was a mistake of Vikings. The Vikings should have looked for that first before looking for the biology. We need to find the water to drive the biochemistry. We need the chemistry, the carbon, the hydrogen, the nitrogen, the oxygen, the phosphorus, and the sulfur to help form the proteins and the nucleic acids essential to our genetic code. And we need the energy for life to grow, to reproduce, and to adapt to its environment. Without these, life would not have arisen on Earth. What curiosity has found is the right chemistry to provide the circumstances for life. Those chemicals, the carbon, the hydrogen, the oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, evidence of water, probably benign enough for us to have drunk if we had been there 3.5 billion years ago. Organic carbon, the key building block of life, and bioavailable nitrogen, that's really key. Nitrogen in the right form for life to make it usable. And we found active methane. Now, there are lots of reasons why that methane is there, but one of the most alluring is it could be the result of the activities of microbes called methanogens on Mars today, under the surface, but that's a byproduct, the methane. We've learned that Mars had a thicker atmosphere. We kind of knew that, but that was a confirmation, and that it was indeed wetter and warmer billions of years ago. And we've also discovered that the radiation on the surface of Mars is far higher than we thought it might be, and this is a key thing for the safety of astronauts in the future. The chances are we are going to have to build habitats under the surface of Mars, unlike Matt Damon's inflatable dome, because of the radiation issue over a long period of time, and especially added to the radiation doses that astronauts would receive on the very long journey to Mars. So where does Australia fit into the search for life on Mars? Well, CSIRO and NASA worked together with the Canberra Deep Space Communication Complex at Tipimbilla, quite close to here, and they've done that for more than 50 years. In 2012, the complex had the prime responsibility for guiding the Mars landing of the car-sized rover Curiosity. And many of you would have visited the complex visitor centre there in Tipimbilla. But when it comes to the search for life on Mars, the deepest connection to Australia is the early life we find in the Pilbara. So there are two sites relevant to this. One is a modern-day environment, Shark Bay in Western Australia, which is actually a heritage listed park. And these are stromatolites. Now, stromatolites are communities of mats of microbes that create a layered rock structure like these. Now, I've mentioned the Pilbara in Western Australia, which is further north. And we look at these rocks, and you can see the lines that would appear. If you cut one of these modern-day stromatolites open, it would be layered just like we can see in these ancient rocks. But remember, I said earlier that just looking at shape is not good enough. We can't look at the organics and Very few of them have microfossils embedded in them. So we have to look for the chemical evidence as well. One of our students, past doctoral students, Dr. Abby Allwood, spent some her research time out in the Pilbara. The area is inset there, where you can see the Shore River. It's a very wide, sandy river that's mostly dry. It does flood sometimes, and it cuts through the area that she was looking at, an area called the Trendle locality. She was looking at a sedimentary environment, a sedimentary chert. It's a very fine-grained sedimentary rock. And she collected samples year after year. We have a very short field season because of the conditions up in the Pilbara. It goes from about June to late August. And she found 7 species of stromatolites, different kinds of shapes in the rocks. And she was getting near the end of her doctorate, and she was collecting the last of her samples, trying to make sense of this pattern. So she went back to camp, and she took a stick, and in the sand, she drew a shape. The shape was the track of where she had collected all of her data. And she put in the data as dots in the sand. And when she looked at it, she realized that she was looking at a microbial reef. Now, why did she know that? Well, we know that stromatolites only live in intertidal zones. And all of her samples were not, but they were in the middle. They weren't at one end where it would have been very dry, virtually no water, and they weren't at the other end where we knew the ancient water had been very deep. They were right in the middle. She couldn't wait. She couldn't sleep that night to go and walk that track, which is here, and some of the stromatolites that she saw, and confirmed what she had written, what she had scribed out in the sand. And that resulted in a paper in the respected journal Nature. Took the front cover of it, because what Abby had done is she had shown that controversy that lasted for 40 years. Is it biology or is it geology? She had solved that, at least for these ones in the sedimentary environment. The diversity and the complexity and the environmental associations on a multi-kilometre scale. It was hard to refute. These stromatolites were living 3.43 billion years ago. In fact, Abby said in her paper, the evidence was so powerful that it made this idea that it was biology an ordinary, plausible explanation. The opposite, that it was created by geology, was the extraordinary claim. The paper landed her a postdoc at NASA JPL, and in 2014, she was named as one of the 7 principal investigators on the Mars 2020 mission, each of those investigators taking their own experiment onto that mission. It makes her the first woman to be leading an experiment on a Mars rover mission, and the first Australian. Abby's experiment is the planetary instrument for X-ray lithochemistry. Bit of a mouthful, but shortened, it's called PIXL. It's designed to look at the very fine detail at the chemistry in the Martian rocks, like pixels in a picture. This allows for the relationships in the rocks to be investigated for possible biosignatures, evidence of past life on Mars. And all of Abby's experience in the Pilbara is coming to the fore in exploring for life on Mars. Abby's water, as I said, was in a sedimentary rock environment, a shallow water environment. But nearby, there is a volcanic environment where we find stromatolites, and had been controversial. Another of our students, who's still doing her doctorate, Tara Jockett, has been working in the area called the Dresser Formation. The area there looked like this to explain these 2 environments. In the foreground, the sedimentary environment would have been in the front there, and Tara's area would have been there in the back with the volcanic area. This is what the Dresser Formation looks like today, crumbling red hills with stromatolites. There are, as I said, some lines of evidence that point to these stromatolites being biology, but they've been pretty controversial. You can see in the inset picture, they're also very much more degraded than Abby's lovely pictures of the stromatolites in the Trendle locality. But our views of that have changed because Tara one night took a shortcut back to camp after a day's work in the field, and she found this very strange rock. It just didn't fit in with anything she'd ever seen. It has its textural and chemical features consistent with modern geyserite. What is geyserite? Well, it's a rock that you find in the hot spring environment. And she said, great, and we proved it was a geyserite. But how did that fit into the Dressel Formation? Well, she worked out how the hot fluids must have been flowing through this system, and you can see where she's drawn on the top in blue where the hot spring environment would have been. That resulted in a paper showing that we had discovered this hot spring environment that was going billions of years earlier than we had previously seen any other hot spring environment. And it advanced our understanding of the earliest evidence of life on Earth by 580 million years. So basically, we now have a high level of confidence that these two different environments in the Pilbara supported life billions of years ago. I'm going to allow Tara to tell you the rest of the story in this next video.
This Pilbara landscape looks a little like the surface of Mars. So it's appropriate that what we found here not only has implications for the origins of life on Earth, but also for the search for life on Mars. It was on my first research trip here that I found this little rock. And this rock shows us that life lived on land 580 million years earlier than we previously thought. It also shows that hot springs were forming 3 billion years earlier than we previously knew. These findings suggest that the origin of life could have occurred in hot springs on land rather than in deep sea hydrothermal vents. Right
3.5 billion years ago.
You've got microbial textures with geyserite within millimetre scale sitting on top of it.
This is a real shift in the way we think that you can't make life in the oceans. It had to be on land. And what we found in these Dressel Formation hot spring rocks, they have the right chemistry for origin of life studies. So actually we've got the whole recipe here right in front of us 3.5 billion years ago in rocks that are the same age as much of the crust on Mars. And so we can use this information to guide about where to search for life on the red planet. And hot springs on Earth, we know all through the geological record now, have signs of life and the right chemistry for origins of life. So if you're going to go to another planet, those are the two ingredients to search for. And we have a place that has hot spring deposits of this age on Mars, and we just think that's so exciting.
It still amazes me that we were able to find this needle in a haystack, and that this piece of Australian research may alter our understanding of the origins of life on Earth and the search for life on Mars.
So Martin was talking about the hot spring environment on Mars, and this is where it is in Gusev crater in an area called Home Plate. And these trenches were caused by the rover Spirit, which had damaged its front right wheel, so the engineers had to drive it backwards, and it was ploughing up the soil of Mars and revealed this pure silica, which is a common element found in hot springs. But more exciting nearby were these digitates, these cauliflower structures. In the top two pictures, these are the ones on Mars, and we can compare it to identical ones here on Earth in El Tatio in Chile, which is in a very Mars-like environment. So very exciting, and it's one of the 3 sites left for the Mars 2020 mission site selection. So we're keeping our fingers crossed for that. But it means going back to a place where a rover has been, so that's a high-risk thing, but the evidence is very compelling. So just briefly, some other students that are at NASA from the ACA, Dr. Adrian Brown, you can see in the top right-hand picture there, Abby in the foreground and Adrian just behind her. They finished their doctorates at the same time. He was on the Mars Reconnaissance Mission and is now Deputy Program Scientist for the Mars Exploration Program. David Flannery completed his doctorate, is now on Abby's team at NASA JPL. You saw in that previous slide that David was working there with a couple of our students from our Mars Lab project. The Mars Lab is a 140 square metre Mars yard in the Powerhouse Museum in Sydney. And in the first iteration, we had just one rover, Martian. It's in partnership with the Australian Centre for Field Robotics at the University of Sydney and, of course, the museum. At this point, only schools only in Sydney probably could come because they actually had to visit the museum, so it was restricted. Then we got our second grant that allowed us to build 2 more experimental rovers to add a video conferencing facility and critically a super fast internet connection. So schools across Australia and internationally can now join the project. They can drive these rovers from their classroom and plan missions and understand how scientists are go about their missions. We've had some pretty sophisticated results as well. These are students from the Mars Lab. They met every Saturday for 8 months. They looked at a particular research question that they refined and defined, and then they worked with Arizona State University in the Mars Student Imaging project and obtained a picture of a crater that they were particularly interested in Mars from the Themis camera on board the Odyssey spacecraft. They produced a paper. It was accepted at a scientific conference, and they were invited to provide that for refereed conference proceedings, which means year 10 and 11 students had a research paper before going to university. They usually don't get that until they're research students and finish their first degree. We have focus groups as well, and students talk spontaneously about how science is tenuous and an ongoing process, not the cookbook recipe they're taught at high school, which has the elements of the way you do science, but not in that kind of order. Each of the rovers represents a complete doctorate. The Mars Lab is a living lab, and it's perhaps one of the longest surviving living labs in a public environment in the world. The students drive the rovers through this graphical user interface, and as it happens, we've captured a student from the University of Sydney, Will Reed, with one of the rovers which he built. And NASA became so interested in that they have actually built a similar rover at NASA JPL for a future Mars mission, and Will has gone from his doctorate into a postdoc at NASA JPL. All of the past students who are now at NASA are just ordinary Australians who had an extraordinary dream. What it says is you have to work hard and be single-minded about your goal to do the same. We have a new Australian Space Agency announced for Australia, but we've already accomplished much in Australia's role in the search for life on Mars, both in research and in STEM research. To close, this last video for you to enjoy, snaps of moments from the development of the Mars Lab. Enjoy. Thank you.
All right, I've been told we have two people with microphones here, and there's a microphone for you people on the top, right there in the middle. And so now it's time for questions for Carol. So can you raise your hand and somebody with a microphone will come to see you? And let's have the first one here.
Yeah. Hi. So I just had a question about Mars exploration more broadly. So I know that, especially with the moon back a couple of decades ago, it was a very political thing with the space race and all that. And I'm just wondering whether that sort of Mars exploration, is it more collaborative, like throughout the globe? Is there still an element of competition? And what's the sort of like politics surrounding it?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. I don't think there's no Cold War to drive this, and other nations are now coming on board to explore Mars. For example, the European Space Agency, which I didn't mention during this talk, but they have Mars Express in orbit around Mars, and they've got ExoMars going in 2020 as well. So they're very significant contributions. And they have their Russians involved. I think the one remarkable thing today about space exploration, and one of the reasons why we need a space agency, is no matter what the differences are between, say, America, Russia, China, they all collaborate in space because space is a very dangerous place to be. And I would like to see something that Carl Sagan, the astronomer whom I had the privilege of interviewing in the 1980s, he said to me he had this vision that Russia and America would build a huge spaceship in orbit to go to Mars. It would be wonderful if something like that happened. But definitely the level of space collaboration is separate from the politics going on in our world, and it's really wonderful to see.
Okay, the next question will be from this Mr. up there. But please, Laura and Jeff, can you find any other questions? We want to get these questions two at a time. So there's one for you, Laura, and there's one back there for you, Jeff. All right, sir, up there.
Thank you for your talk. Do we have any theories as to how the perchlorates were formed? And secondly, do we have any idea how the violets actually managed to dispose of them?
No, we don't know how the perchlorates have formed. As far as I know, I'm not a scientist, so they may have worked that one out. But the violets have been tested in Holland, where various plants were being trialed to see how we might bioremediate the Martian soil to our needs, and it turned out violets did best.
Question down here.
Thank you for that talk. Given the inconclusive nature of previous probes looking for life, what sort of confidence level can we reasonably have that the 2020 mission would find life if there was life there?
Well, I don't think we should expect that the 2020 mission will find life. They will find evidence of life. Hopefully. That's as close as you can get, because the same arguments that we've seen in the Pilbara will rage until we get a sample return back to Earth to much more complex labs here on Earth, where we can be more convinced that what we're looking at is life. But the really interesting thing is, in human exploration of Mars, there are 7 caves on Mars where it would be ideal to actually set up an inflatable module for astronauts to be in, because it'd be protected from the radiation. The reason we won't do that is because that's the most likely place that life will exist on Mars.
Okay, question up here.
Hello. I can't be very specific on this, but in the last few months, a group of scientists were in charge of a vehicle that was looking at another planet, and they're extremely worried about what to do with their vehicle because it is the end of its thing. Now, they were very happy when it was destroyed in some thing around the planet to make absolutely sure that nothing from Earth was going to infect that. Now, it appears that we're going to rain a whole lot of stuff on Mars looking for life and we may be doing much of this inimical to life on Mars, a bit like the early European explorers going to South America.
Yeah, I agree with that perspective. We know that the spacecraft we're sending to Mars may well have earthly microbes on them that can survive the trip. In particular, there's one that survives the clean room, NASA JPL. But the only thing I can say is that's the whole planet we're looking at. And the surface of Mars equals the surface of the Earth. So if you landed something, say, in Australia, and there was no life here, and you landed something in Australia, it wouldn't probably affect something in, say, Europe. Our choice is either go and explore and do the best we can, or not explore at all and leave it pristine. Some people would like to leave it pristine.
Okay, let's get 2 more questions. One over there, Laura, and over here somewhere. Another question over on this side of the room for Jeff. All right, let's go with that one then. Do we have any Twitter questions? Any Twitter questions? Okay, go ahead.
So my question's a little bit more earthbound. You mentioned that the centre was looking to an approach that did communications with the learning as well. I've noticed that there's been a lot of radio astronomy and black hole kind of astronomy communications that are out there. So I just wanted to ask, this is obviously something very Australia-centric. What are you guys kind of doing to make sure that, to actually disseminate what you guys are finding out in the Pilbara to, well, Australians firstly and everyone else after?
Yes. So I think well, first of all, I think there's 2 parts. One, the Mars Lab is international. And so in that we talk about the Pilbara and about how that impacts our search for life on Mars. And in the other ways we do that is obviously through the media. But we haven't actually outreached to schools yet specifically about the Pilbara. I think it would fit into the curriculum. I'm not quite sure. And that's really the basic problem, is fitting into the curriculum. The teachers don't have the time. So the only way that you can outreach to schools is through projects like the Mars Lab, where they do something special. Yeah, so I think it's a real problem. And I think there is another issue in our schools in that the teachers who are teaching science have never experienced research by and large, and therefore they can't really teach the way scientists think to the students. I think that's a real problem that we've got to overcome.
All right, question there, Jeff? Right, just wait for the microphone, please. It'll be there in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1.
Thank you for the talk. I've got a very quick question. How deep this new Explorer, the one is going 2020, will go deep down in the crust of Mars to look for life?
I think you're referring to ExoMars, and for ExoMars it's 2 meters.
All right, any last questions? Up there, up top. Last questions are.
Hi, you've spoken about some of the things you're looking for to prove that there has been life on Mars. Is there anything that you might find that would disprove life on Mars?
That's a really interesting question. How do you disprove life on Mars? I think my answer to that might be that because science is so skeptical, that we constantly are aiming to disprove that is life. Like in the Pilbara, we were constantly aiming to disprove those fossils were life. We had to find the patterns that confirmed that it was life. So that's disproving in process.
Okay, and now I thought we'd do a little survey here. Who thinks that there is life on Mars today? Raise your hand. Who thinks that there's life not on Mars today, but there used to be life? And who thinks that there was never life on Mars and never will be? Look at that. I've never done that, sir. All right. So,
interesting.
Yes. Is that representative of the audiences you've spoken to?
Yeah, I think so, yes.
Okay. All right, so a huge thank you to Carol for joining us tonight. And that was fascinating. And now, also thank you to our online audience for joining us here at the Shine Dome. And tonight's talk will be made available on the Academy's YouTube channel. This is the last talk in the Dawn of the New Space Age series, and we wish to thank you all who have been involved in putting this together, especially for our chairs and speakers and our conveners, Professor Matthew Collis and Professor Tamara Davis. Thank you again to our sponsors for supporting the entire series throughout the year. There's Ajira Wines at Gier Station and Edge Catering. Now next year, starting in February, the Academy invites you back to the Shine Dome, the Mars Embassy, for our next series entitled From Womb to Tomb, The Science of Our Lives. This new series will take us on a journey and explore everything from the miracle of birth and early life to the uncomfortable subject of death. Thank you once again. Happy festive season. We hope to see you back for the first talk in February. Good night. All right, right on time.
Jeff Burns from and I'm Director of Curriculum Development here, producing an online science textbook